Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You've heard a little bit of my bio, and the last bit about amateur birdwatching provoked a reaction in one of your distinguished universities, because the very first question I got was, what is an amateur bird? I would like to thank you very much for the warmth of your welcome, and thank the Veritas Forum and the university for putting on this evening's event. It is a very interesting thing to come for the first time to your distinguished university, especially when I discovered that it's for any person and any study. And that means that an Irish mathematician gets a seat at the table. And so I'm delighted to be with you this evening. Now, you've asked me to join in a discussion with Professor Avery about the most difficult question that we face as human beings. The exact expression of the title is Reason in a Place of Pain, the compatibility of faith and reason in light of suffering. And I've been overwhelmed in the last couple of days just watching the TV news from the Philippines. A short time ago, I arrived in Christchurch, New Zealand, 2 days after the earthquake, and had to meet people who'd lost their husbands and their wives just a few days before. Suffering is extremely real, and there are no simplistic answers. But you'll notice the emphasis on reason, because when we suffer or when we see pain, our reason cries out, I nearly said screams, for explanation. And so we're going to try and look at that, and look at it with as much sympathy and empathy with those who suffer as is possible. Evil and suffering come from two logically distinct sources, though in practice these sources are inextricably bound together. The first is suffering for which men and women are directly responsible, such as 9/11, and leads to the problem of moral evil. The second is suffering as a result of natural disasters, disease, earthquakes, tsunamis, cancers, for which human beings are not so self-evidently responsible. And that leads to the problem of natural evil, or the problem of pain. So there are two sources, but there are also two perspectives. It's one thing to be an oncologist. It's another to be told that you've 3 months to live because you've got terminal cancer. There's the inside story of the person who's suffering the indignity or the pain or the disease. And there's the outside story of those of us who watch from the sidelines, maybe, and observe it. But then there are two approaches to it, or are there, indicated by our title, Faith and Reason, but they're actually not two approaches. Because faith and reason, properly understood, are inextricably bound together, because faith, contrary to the modern perception, is not a religious word merely, and it does not mean believing where there's no evidence. The word faith comes from the Latin fides. It means trust. And of any trust in anything, any proposition, any person, any idea, you of course ask the logical question, what are the reasons for your trust? And I'm here as a Christian who believes in evidence-based faith. And we need to realize that when people look at suffering, some think that the only option is to believe that there is no God. So their faith is atheism, which is every much a faith system, a belief system, as Christianity. Others believe in God in spite of the suffering, so that their belief system is theism, in my case, Christian theism. The crucially important thing is to see that it's balanced. Both of these worldviews are our belief systems. And the issue is, which is the most reasonable in light of pain and suffering? In other words, what way does the evidence point? Which worldview has the largest explanatory power when it comes to coping with these things? I say this because there is such confusion. I debated Peter Singer in Melbourne, and it was very interesting because he said, you know, my big objection to religion is people stay in the religion in which they're brought up. I had told them that my parents were Christian. And so I thought it would be interesting to put to him the same question. So I said, tell us, Peter, about your parents. Were they atheists? And he said, yes, they were. So I said, you remained in the faith in which you were brought up. Oh, but he said it wasn't a faith. It isn't a faith. I said, sorry, I was under the impression you believed it. Now, that was very interesting, but it showed that he's bought into this redefinition of faith. You'll find it in Webster's dictionary. Faith, noun, believing where there's no evidence. And the result of the permeation of academia with that redefinition of faith is that people have become unbalanced, and they think that Christianity is a faith, but atheism isn't. And we'll never get anywhere with this question until we redress that balance and think that there are these two major worldviews, atheism and theism, that attempt to answer the big questions, and they're both belief systems. So the proper question to ask is, how does suffering and pain fit within the compass of those two? So that's the way I'm going to approach it. The problem is so clear. David Hume said, Epicurus's old questions are yet unanswered. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then is he impotent. Is he able but not willing? Then is he malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then this evil? And there are many people, and I count among them many friends, who think that events like the floods in the Philippines, the earthquake in New Zealand, or the Holocaust and 9/11, examples of both the problem of moral evil and the problem of pain, show us that there is no God. In fact, some say even more. They think that religion is part of the problem of suffering because it causes so much suffering in the world. Indeed, Richard Dawkins says that 9/11 radicalized him. This is religion. It's a step too far. Therefore, in order to balance it, we have to abolish all religion. And when people say, but that's extreme jihadist religion, he says, but extreme religion thrives on the periphery of moderate religion, so the only answer is to get rid of all religion. And Steven Weinberg, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics, said the best contribution that science can make to this generation, for that reason, is to eliminate religion. He went even further. He said anything that we can do as scientists should be done in order to do that. And that sounded a little bit like a totalitarian threat that might cause a lot of suffering in the attempt to destroy religion. Now, this is a question that we need to face. Of course, it is a very foolish thing to put extreme jihadists and the Amish into the same category. We need to learn to differentiate, just as it would be a mistake to put atheists like Richard Dawkins into the same category as atheists like Stalin. He wants me to differentiate. I want to ask him to do exactly the same thing. Now, I'm from Northern Ireland, ladies and gentlemen, and it hasn't the best reputation as an advert for the Christian faith. And I need to explain a little bit of that, because this is a question that I feel personally. My parents were very unusual because they were Christian without being sectarian. That's the first thing. And as an expression of that, my father insisted in his small business, and he was not an educated man in the contemporary sense, of employing equally across the divided community, Protestant and Catholic. That resulted in bombings. It resulted in my brother nearly losing his life, losing the sight of an eye, 300 stitches put in his face. So we know something about, a little about, the effects of terrorism that is sectarian. But my brother didn't lose his faith, and nor have I. And it's very important for me to address this question head on, if you'll forgive me. What do I think of the violence in Northern Ireland and the impression it's given that Christianity is a violent religion? I'm ashamed of it. Utterly and thoroughly ashamed of it. But let me explain why. I'm ashamed that the name of Christ has ever been associated with the AK-47. Because when you read the New Testament, you find that Christ forbade the use of weapons to defend him or his message. And the irony of the modern position, and I put it to Christopher Hitchens, I said, Christopher, your criticisms about the violence of religion are the same ones that Jesus made. If you took seriously what he said, you'd be on his side rather than fighting against him. Because the irony of this whole situation is that Christ was put on trial for what? Fomenting political violence. Exactly what the new atheists accused Christianity of. He was for it, and he was exonerated by Pilate when he said to the Roman governor, my kingdom is not of this world, otherwise my servants would be fighting. And Pilate realized he was no political threat, especially when he went on to say, to this end I was born, and to this end I came into the world, that I would bear witness to the truth. And the hardened soldier and campaigner Pilate said, what is truth? I don't think he was being cynical, but I think he realized that if this was a king of the truth, he wasn't much of a threat to a political, power-hungry governor. Especially, ladies and gentlemen, the kind of truth that Jesus represented. Because Pilate realized, you see, that the one thing you cannot do is impose truth by violence. Especially if it's truth about the love of God, forgiveness, peace with God. That's absurd. So I'm making 2 points. And the major point is this: people who take up weapons to defend Christ or to propagate his message are not obeying him, they're disobeying him. And therefore they do not deserve the name Christian. And sometimes when people say, well, there's rather a lot of this around, I say, look, the existence of counterfeit money doesn't prove that the real stuff doesn't exist, but it can make it hard to find. And it seems to me that's very important. Now, other religions, I speak as a Christian tonight, I can't start defending, and I shouldn't. They have the right to defend themselves on this score. But it's very clear that at the outset, Christianity was a non-violent religion, so we cannot accuse it. But there's another side to this question, ladies and gentlemen. Richard Dawkins loves to quote the song by John Lennon. Do you know the song, Imagine? Imagine a world without, well, actually, when he quotes it, he talks about imagining a world without the Taliban and without Northern Ireland. How could you possibly imagine a world without Northern Ireland? I mean, that's absurd. But okay, let's take his point. But you see, I'm not John Lennon, I'm John Lennox. And I've written the song, and it's called Imagine. Imagine a world without Pol Pot. Imagine a world without Mao Zedong. Imagine a world without Stalin. What about that world? Now, here's a very interesting thing I discover in atheist writings, virtually no mention. The 20th century is airbrushed out. And yet, there's no excuse for a single person murdered in the name of religion, but the multi-millions that were murdered in the name of an atheistic philosophy. And Richard Dawkins writes in his book, I don't know an atheist who would bulldoze a cathedral like Chartres and Notre Dame. And I was speaking at the Academy of Sciences in Poland, and I read this out, and they stopped me, and they said, send them over to us. And then a very brilliant East German writer said, Dawkins is right, because cathedrals are too big for bulldozers. Stalin and Ulbricht used dynamite to blow them up. And I visited many holes in the ground where churches in hundreds were blown up. And to write that you can't imagine an atheist doing it means you don't understand 20th century history. And that leads me to be very suspicious. Because this kind of formula, blame it all on religion, all the suffering in the world, the moral suffering, Exonerate atheism just won't work, ladies and gentlemen. I'll never forget, and it's happened more than once, a senior member of the Russian Academy of Sciences, and I've spent a lot of time there because I wanted to know what atheism does to a society. I speak their language. He said to me, John, we thought that we could abolish God and retain a value for human beings, and we found we couldn't. We murdered multi-millions of them. So every time you think of this accusation against religion, parallel it with the same thing when it comes to atheism. But of course, when we think about the big disasters, they tend to short-circuit our minds. We can't cope with the sheer quantity of it. And yet, as some people have pointed out, in one sense, you can't add suffering. Because suffering consists of individual suffering. And the maximum amount, in a sense, is the maximum amount that you as an individual can suffer. And you look at 9/11, it might have faded because your mum has just been diagnosed with cancer, or you've had some awful experience, and it fills your whole horizon. I understand that, because we're all in the same boat with this. We all have to face these deep questions that are shaken to the surface when pain or moral evil hit us, and we start to ask those deep, deep questions. And I want to make sure that you understand that I'm very sympathetic with those whose personal experience of suffering leads them to reject God. I have stood in Auschwitz many times, and I've wept every time. Now, if we go into atheism, and I say I understand people that do that, I have many friends who do it. Let's take a reasoned look at that step. Is atheism the only belief system that is a reasonable response to suffering and evil? Well, listen to Dawkins' analysis of evil. I mentioned Richard Dawkins because most people have read his books and they're accessible. He says this: the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. No good, no evil. The suicide bombers of 9/11 were dancing to the music of their DNA. That's the end of morality, ladies and gentlemen. And here comes the odd thing. Dawkins has abolished morality, and yet he's outraged at 9/11. There's a double think going on here. The logic of his atheism is to abolish morality, but that removes all grounds for his criticism. Now, of course, Nietzsche brilliantly saw this years ago. He said this: when one gives up Christian belief, one therefore deprives oneself of the right to Christian morality. Why morality, he asks, at all when life, nature, history are non-moral? Morality only possesses truth if God is truth. It stands or falls with belief in God. And that I count as an extremely important thing. Now, a question comes at this point. Why does God allow suffering anyway? Could he not created us without the capacity for moral evil, and the universe without the propensity to fracture? And of course he could. Of course he could. He could have made us all robots, automatically programmed. But you know, I have a wife, I've been married 45 years, and I'm glad she's not a robot. Why is that? Because robots cannot love. Now here's the heart of one of the problems. You see, the capacity to love is a wonderful thing. But you wouldn't have it if God created a world in which everything was pre-programmed. Because that capacity to love depends on the capacity to choose, and if you're able to choose yes, you must be able to choose no. And it seems to me that C.S. Lewis and many other thinkers are exactly right when they trace a large part of this problem to the fact that we've chosen wrongly. And people who wish for a universe in which that wasn't possible actually logically are wishing themselves out of existence, because you couldn't be in it. You, with all your delightful capacities and the love that you experience in a world which, by definition, must have the possibility of experiencing hate. God took a risk, didn't he? I'm a parent, indeed I'm a grandparent. I have 7 grandchildren, and I remember holding the first child and thinking, this little girl could grow up to say no to me. Does that stop anybody having children? Why doesn't it? Because of the value of the love of a child and the expectation that if you as a parent do your best, there may be just a reward in the sense of a loving relationship, but it might go wrong. You still take the risk. And of course the big question comes, and we'll discuss that in our conversation. Granted that it's like that, did God make a big enough provision if things went wrong? Now my answer to that is detailed, but I'm only going to give you the first element of it now, and it's this. At the heart of Christianity is something utterly unique. It's a cross. And Nietzsche used to mockingly say, this God on the cross. But just come with me a moment. I know it's difficult for some of you who disagree with this, but if you're going to understand Christianity, you must at least listen to what it says. The claim is that Jesus was both God and human. So the question that Nietzsche mocked is very real. What is God doing on a cross? Well, at the very least this. It shows me that God has not remained distant from the problem of human suffering and evil, but has himself become part of it. Thank you very much.
Good evening, John. Good evening. Welcome, everybody, to tonight's discussion. John, from the people here in the audience tonight and from the entire Ithaca community, we want to wish you just the warmest of welcome to one of the prettiest campuses you'll ever visit.
Thank you very much.
So, John, here tonight we really are focusing on a very salient issue, and that's the issue of sort of pain and suffering. And you and I had a little discussion at dinner tonight about the fact that maybe for the past week I've been absolutely glued to my television set and in almost a state of shock and disbelief at just the devastation and the pain and suffering that people in the Philippines are going through with this Typhoon Haiyan, and especially in Tacloban. And there's a point that you get to with all of watching all this pain and suffering on the TV where you do get to question sort of why God lets this happen, and if there is a God. And so thank you for coming to shed some light on this question tonight with us, and to bring some of your wisdom and your truth to bear on this issue that we all face. So thank you very much. So let's start off our discussion here tonight. And the first question that I've got for you is, understanding the cause of pain and suffering to a large extent determines how we respond to that pain and suffering in our lives. One way suggested by Dostoyevsky is to simply accept it as a fact of life. And in this regard he says, pain and suffering are always inevitable for a large intelligence and a deep heart. We really great men must, I think, have really great sadness on earth. And then another way that humans respond to this pain and suffering in their lives is simply to harden their hearts against our God. And an interesting quote by Teresa Avila, which is the Spanish nun and mystic, she said, if this is the way you treat your friends, it's no wonder you have so few of them. So my experience tells me that there's another way, and maybe this comes from my own personal experience, to react to pain and suffering, and that's basically to withdraw from any opportunity to get hurt. And Pope Benedict XVI says in this regard, a really interesting quote here, it's when we attempt to avoid suffering by withdrawing from anything that might involve hurt, that we try to spare ourselves the effort and pain of pursuing truth, love, and goodness, that we drift into a life of emptiness, in which there may be almost no pain, but the dark sensation of meaningless and abandonment is all the greater. So here's my question. We'll try to wrap this up. It's sort of like a two-part question. What is the Christian perspective on how to respond to pain and suffering? And maybe sort of a related question is, we all suffer, people from all faiths or no faith suffer, and Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, we all suffer. Sometimes I view people from other religions, particularly Hindus, actually dealing with pain and suffering in their lives a lot better than we Christians, who tend to sort of cry out about it. So my answer to you is, what is it about the Christian faith that brings sort of meaning to our suffering?
Well, the reactions that you've mentioned are all perfectly understandable to me. The idea, Dostoyevsky's point, that suffering is involved in producing character is absolutely right to a point. Because when the suffering becomes extreme, it's obvious it's not producing anything more. When it becomes meaningless and so on. So I think he's right to a certain extent. Just as in another sphere, I know people are very keen on sport here, and you'll see people absolutely pushing their bodies to the limit of pain and endurance to get that body tone so they'd be a big football. So that kind of suffering is understandable because they've got a purpose for doing it. It's when any possible purpose appears to be frustrated that it becomes very difficult. Withdrawing is very understandable, and I think there is a sense often when people have pain, they need to withdraw for a time. I mean, my sister lost her daughter at 22, just married with a brain tumour. She hasn't lost her Christian faith, but she had to withdraw for a time. She just couldn't cope with it. And that's a very understandable reaction. I think we have to be very generous and broad in our understanding. And I think too, I'm glad you mentioned people from other faiths or none, because sometimes even my atheist friends have learned more about la condition humaine and facing suffering, that they come out with a better reaction than some of us who are afraid of going to the dentist, if you see what I mean. And I think we need to absolutely respect that. You see, from where I sit, I would expect that to happen. That often we're shown up by people who have other worldviews for the simple reason that as a Christian, I regard every man and woman as made in the image of God, whether they believe in him or not. And therefore they're moral beings, and therefore they're capable of moral responses, and therefore I can learn from them. In fact, it's that facilitates my debates and discussions around the world, because as far as being made in the image of God is concerned, all of us are equal. Now, what does the Christian faith specifically add? I think that's what you're driving at. Well, the bottom line for me is this, that we can do all we can and we need to alleviate suffering in this world and help the victims. But the fact is, suffering in the Philippines has led to the death of thousands of people. Babies, innocent people, and so on. And before I'm finished this talk, this discussion with you tonight, I don't know how many thousand innocent children will have died. So, if atheism is the right reaction to it, I say yes, it's an understandable reaction. But does it solve anything? It means you have to regard the universe just that's how it is, and you have to just accept it as a brute fact. But there's another thing, it doesn't remove the suffering. And from where I sit, it can make it worse, because if death is the end, and of course here comes an absolutely central Christian belief that because of the resurrection of Jesus, the world begins to look different because death is not the end. There arises then the possibility, and for my understanding, the certainty, not simply the possibility, that God is going to put things right in an utterly fair way that it will be seen to be fair. And atheism removes that completely. So it's that hope, ultimately, that I would have to factor into this equation. Does that go far enough, do you think, or do you want to probe a little bit further?
I think maybe you could speak on, you were talking a little bit earlier about the fact that there's a certain amount of pain that makes sense, but there's pain that is extreme, like in the Philippines. Yeah. One wants to ask the question, what was the reason for that? What's gained by that?
Well, in a sense, I find that impossible to answer. I think Let me put it this way. We haven't yet seen the entire story. And I think there is a day in which we will see the entire story. And when we've seen the whole picture, we might understand something of it. But I'm not sure that all suffering has a purpose in that sense. Because that would mean that evil, malevolent evil, has a purpose. And to come to some of my Jewish friends who've lost all their relatives in the Holocaust and said, by the way, you know, your parents being gassed at Auschwitz has a purpose, would be to insult them and mock them. I think we need to get away of the idea that we can find a purpose of it all. Going back to what's called the free will defense, this universe is a fractured world, and people are fractured beings. They have the capacity to do evil, and that has consequences. Lewis makes the point, and I think he's right, that if God had made a world where if I lift a big stick to hit you, it suddenly becomes rubber, and it doesn't harm you. But if I use it to build a house, it will remain stable. That is again, he argues, that is again to remove free will completely. And it's the consequence of free will, for instance, Hitler's abuse of it, that leads to that. Now, I have to ask the question, since I can't assign a purpose to it for those individuals, I come back to the fact that, do I believe in a God that's going to be big enough and capable to do something about that so that I can in the end look at what he does and say that's right? And I've come to the conclusion that that's the only solution. Otherwise, atheism is the name of the game. But the suffering's still there. And it doesn't have any purpose in suffering at all, of course.
Well, John, let's move on. Let me ask you my second question. And it also relates to this sort of pain and suffering and sources of pain and suffering. In your talk, you mentioned suffering that results from natural causes.
Yes.
And you also mentioned suffering that comes from moral causes. Mm-hmm. So I want to address another source of pain and suffering, and that is mental suffering. Sure. In the form of sort of depression and anxiety.
Yeah, sure.
And depression is just a debilitating condition, and it affects not only the individual but all of those around the individual that love them and support them. In fact, statistics from the Center of Disease Control here in the United States estimates that 21 million people each year suffer from depression. And just to refer back to C.S. Lewis that you used to quote, he has a wonderful quote from his book, The Problem of Pain, that says, "Mental pain is less dramatic than physical pain, and it's more common and also harder to bear. The frequent attempt to conceal mental pain increases its burden." And just to refer here, here at Cornell over the last several years, we've had just the tragic suicides of several students, as many other universities have experienced. And so this is my question for you. Where does mental pain and suffering originate, and what role does God play in that process?
All of us suffer at times from various degrees of depression. That's very clear, and it's very sad when people don't realize that this is a very deep and painful sort of suffering. I'm actually the kind of chaplain at my college, so I get talking to students who are in this state, and I'm very well aware of the suicidal tendencies that are absolutely tragic. Where does it come from? Well, of course, it can come from many sources. Now, I'm not a medical doctor, but I work with a lot of medical doctors. It can come from the imbalance of chemicals in the brain, and that is often treatable very successfully. But it can come from wrong decisions. It can come from decisions we make, maybe in good faith, and suddenly our world crumbles because of those decisions, and we can see no way out. So it seems to me there are huge amounts, very varied sources. Now, the question is, or one of the questions that I have asked myself, you see, if you go back to Richard Dawkins, he's written a book called The God Delusion, that God is a delusion. Now, delusion is a psychiatric term. And there's been a very interesting book written recently by the president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, the past president in Britain, on is faith a delusion? And he makes this very interesting point. He says there's a meta-study, that is a study of studies, has been done on the relationship between, amongst other things, religious belief and depression. And he says the results have been kept essentially secret. He calls it the best kept secret of psychiatry, that faith in God makes a significant difference. Now, this is many epidemiological studies that say if you look at depression, if you look at substance abuse, if you look at marital happiness, if you look at tendency to suicide, all of those are significantly diminished by faith in God. Now, I find this very interesting. And he points this out. He said, if the results of this study had gone in the opposite direction, it would be headline news throughout the world. But because it has favored religious belief, nobody knows about it. And it's a major report in the American Journal of Health. And it seems to be, therefore, an answer to your question, that a scientific analysis, whatever else we're going to say, all other things being equal, that belief in God and coping with depression are two things that are actually quite closely related. So I want to say that we can discuss the sources, and you need to be a medic and a psychiatrist and so on to all the sources, but when it comes to the alleviation of the problem, belief in God is, it would seem, the scientific evidence, and I emphasize that because Dawkins is claiming to be a scientist and he calls it a delusion, which is a very dangerous thing to say to people for whom their faith in God is one of the biggest comforts they've got in their psychiatric depression.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, John. So I want to refer now back to a debate that you did, or a discussion that you did with atheist Gideon Rosen, which I'm assuming you remember, right?
I do.
He questioned your faith in God, and he asked the questions such as this: who lets these types of disasters happen? And he really questions loving and trusting a God who stands aside in the face of such devastating consequences. In fact, he maintains that the faith and worship of such a God is indicative of pathological thinking and belief. And during the debate that you had with him, he asked you the following question, and I'm really interested to hear your response to that same question tonight. How can any person love and trust a God who causes or allows such devastating pain and suffering? Doesn't this raise questions regarding the ethics of devotion for Christians?
Well, I would in part answer him now the way what I've just said is that regarded as pathological doesn't stand up to the scientific evidence. It seems to be not pathological. And Andrew Sim's conclusion is precisely that. He mentions that thing. But I understand, of course, where Gideon Rosen is coming from. Now, this is actually a complex question. I want to explain part of it, why it is. Take the earthquake in Christchurch. Now, I had to face it. I was flying out and the earthquake happens and I had to change all my lectures and lectures on earthquake why, you see. And I had to think very carefully about that. Because here's the odd thing. If there were no tectonic plates, neither you or I would be alive. Because life, biological life of all kinds, is dependent on the shifting of those plates and the fact that they float on the surface of the magma in the earth. Now, that's a fascinating thing, and it leads to a very strange paradox, that here is a mechanism that is responsible for life, and yet it's killing. Now, why does it kill? The earthquakes aren't evil. If you build a house on top of a fault line, well, you may well be asking for trouble. And so the earthquake's doing its job of maintaining life, atmospheric balance, and so on the planet, and yet it's an agent of destruction. And that raises now the philosophical question instantly. Could God not make fire that doesn't burn but warms? Could he make electricity that isn't dangerous? and so on. And here we're back to the same thing. Now, I noticed Gideon Rosen was very careful in saying causes are allowed. Now, I would wipe out the word cause, because from where I sit, God doesn't cause evil, but the nature of the universe is that it's a possibility because of his gift of freedom. And I suspect myself that that gift of freedom, when abused originally, actually had an effect on the natural world and the created universe. Now that's another big question. But to say that it leads to be devoted to a God like that, I understand them perfectly if there's no rationale behind it. And I feel, having thought about this for most of my life really, because I feel it's the hardest question, I think there's enough reason to trust God with those ragged edges. And my main reason for doing that is actually the cross. This is God becoming part of suffering. It's not an explanation in the sense of a logical explanation. It's a demonstration. And therefore, let me put it this way. I have sufficient confidence in God to worship him because A, I see he's come near to suffering and has suffered. B, because I believe death is not the end. And C, because I believe there's going to be a final assessment that will put things right. And of course it centrally depends on whether the Christian faith is true or not. If I didn't believe it was true, I'd have no answers.
That's a better answer than you gave during your previous debate. Well done.
Well, I don't remember what answer I gave during the previous debate.
So, John, let's move on. In considering these two sources of evil, this natural evil and this moral evil, I want to sort of turn to another issue that I've been thinking about quite a lot lately. And that is the Bible hints in some of the books of the Bible to a larger picture we might be missing if we simply take evil as being either natural evil or moral evil. And I want to start with maybe considering the book of Job and what it tells us about this. So this is what I've sort of been thinking about, and that is, first of all, the book of Job tells us that Job was a righteous man. So I'm assuming from that he was to a certain extent blameless. But it tells us also that Job was caught up in a much bigger theater of war that was going on, occurring, and it was really occurring between these forces of good and evil, between a moral God and between Satan. It seems as the story evolves, God gives permission to Satan in the book to bring about this devastation of Job's family and all his belongings. So here's my question. Are we, like Job, simply caught up as innocent victims in the midst of this supernatural war? And is the supernatural evil a source of evil that's outside of our own moral failure?
Yes and no. In the sense that I wouldn't put it like caught up as innocent victims, as if this was something terrible. But I do think there's a bigger theater. The very interesting thing is the moment you begin to talk about a bigger picture, about God and a force of evil that's personified, Satan, the world tends to laugh. I find that very odd, ladies and gentlemen, I must say, because most of my scientific friends believe the whole universe is populated by endless aliens. It's just when the Bible says there might be other powers that they start to laugh. That is totally inconsistent. We know so little about our universe, and the Bible, interestingly, doesn't put all the blame on humanity, but says there was an evil rebellion at a much higher level. And I don't find a difficulty in believing that even as a scientist, because it seems to me there are various levels of life. There's bacterial life, there's animal life, there's human life. Does it stop there? According to the Bible, no. There is life. There are spirit beings. Now, we're not going to go into that in detail. The important thing is the question that the Bible claims that there's been a rebellion at a higher level than human, and it's affected Earth. The best writer I've ever read that has really captured this is C.S. Lewis. in his science fiction trilogy, that we are caught up in a huge battle. But the amazing thing is that God has chosen that human beings should play a very significant part of that battle. And the central claim of Christianity is staggering. It's that God became human. And part of the reason of doing that was to save humanity, but it was also to win that decisive victory against the ultimate supernatural powers of evil. And so, therefore, I see Job, and Job's very interesting because God comforts Job, and he has the problem of moral and natural evil. It's very carefully put at the beginning, because he loses some of his possessions as a result of fire coming down from the sky and so on. Others because the Sabaeans' raid. You've got the problem of moral evil and natural evil. And most of the time, God comforts Job by talking to him about the universe. And I used to think that's the oddest thing I've ever read. You know, were you there when I put the stars in the sky? Can you organize the snow and the rain and so on? And then I met a man who was 7 years in solitary confinement in Tibet. And I said to him, some of you will know his name, Jeffrey Bull. I said, Jeffrey, what saved your sanity? He said, a little bird. It came and sat on the sill and the window and the bars. And he said, I looked at that and I thought, there's something perfect in this universe. It's not all evil. And he said, for 7 years when I sat in there, it was that little bird and the odd bits of the Bible I was able to remember that saved my sanity. It was exactly the Job effect. So I think, yes, there's a bigger picture, but we're not, in that sense, innocent victims. The amazing thing is this, to my mind, that we could easily be overwhelmed by superior force and powers. And God, in his mercy to us, when he comes into our world, he doesn't come in blazing light, threatening people and so on. He comes almost incognito so that people can have a cup of coffee or a glass of wine with him and chat to him, so that they can get to know what God is like. Now, if I were to continue this, the examples I would give is a New Testament example that corresponds to Job. And that is the disciple, Peter, who before the crucifixion, Jesus said to him, Satan has desired to have you, that is all the disciples, that he may sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith shouldn't fail. And you know, Peter denied the Lord and so on. But the very interesting thing is this: Satan has asked to have you. He's not in control. This is not a yin and yang, a dualistic universe with equal powers of good and evil. Satan's powers are limited. He's asked to have you to do what? Sift you as wheat. But that's a very strange metaphor, because sifting wheat is to get the good sorted out from the bad. It's not to destroy anything. So, in effect, what God allowed the enemy to do in Peter's heart when he panicked and denied, the purpose of that was to make him the man he became after the crucifixion, who stood up and announced the Christian message fearlessly to the world. So that God is in control of that. Now, this is a huge topic, but I think it's worth putting the parallel to see, or at least to begin to see how it works. And Peter wasn't an innocent victim, but there were forces operating on him that were much bigger than him. But God was involved in the situation, making sure that he still retained his authenticity and his capacity to choose. God doesn't overwhelm us or allow us to be overwhelmed so that we lose all sense of autonomy, authority, and the things that make for character through our own choosing and decision making.
Thanks, John. Well, I've got many, many more questions, but I'm afraid we're sort of coming to the end of, well, at least my section of the questions, and we're going to be transitioning through to student questions in a minute. Let me try and look at maybe the last question here. I want to turn our attention now to God's view on justice here on earth, not the final justice here on earth. And I'm going to ask you a sort of provocative question, and that is, has God changed his mind? And so I'm going to revert back to Old Testament, and we're going to take Psalm 109. And this particular psalm is noted for some of the most frighteningly severe curses in the Bible. Let me just read a couple of them. It says, "Let there be none to extend mercy unto him, neither let there be any to favor his fatherless children." And the psalm goes on to say, "Let his prosperity be cut off, and in the generation following let their name be blotted out." We can also, of course, turn not only to Psalm 109, but to the books of, Exodus and Deuteronomy, where we have God's commandment to genocide in the invasion of Canaan, and the permission of his permission of putting the Israelites into slavery in Egypt. So God seems to have his mind made up in the Old Testament. How do we put the actions of God in the Old Testament together with a God incarnate of the New Testament? A God of love, a God of peace, a God of healing, and turning the other cheek. And so my question for you, from the Old Testament to the New Testament, has God changed his mind about justice here on earth?
Well, now let me try and unpack that a little bit. You quoted Psalm 109. That isn't God speaking. That is the psalmist speaking. Now, when we come to the Bible, there's an interesting thing. Not everything recorded in the Bible is true, is it, or good? We're told a story of David committing adultery, and God later disapproves of it. And I think we've got to open our minds, as C.S. Lewis pointed out, I think, to the idea that in some of the Psalms there is a record of what certain people thought, but it's not necessarily a reflection of the attitude of God. And you can understand somebody who's suffered terribly, people do, as you know, you hear them all the time, wishing all kinds of vengeance on their enemies. So I would give God the benefit of the doubt there and say these are recorded, and I believe they're inspired, but they're not necessarily attitudes that, oh, well, that's the right attitude because it's in that psalm. I think they're there for us to see that here are people who are genuine people, who have a whole range of emotions. Some of them are very good and some of them are very suspect, and we've got to learn to deal with them. The much more weighty issue for me is your second point, because you mentioned the actual point where we know that God steps in. So can I take that point? Because I think it's the more substantive one. It comes up all the time, that you have in Deuteronomy the command to go into Canaan, to Joshua, and wipe everybody out. You see. And people say, but this is ethnic cleansing, this is genocide, and this is God behind it. Now, I take that very seriously, and my response very briefly is this. Number one, this event is described in a book, not an obscure book of the Bible, but a book that defines the very morality with which we criticize it. That is very striking. The laws of humanitarian war, the first ones in history, are in the same book, Deuteronomy. And as Lord Sachs, our former chief rabbi, pointed out, he said they're very humanitarian. Spare the women and children, spare the trees, and so on. Seek peace before you do war. They're all in the very book that describes this event. So the first thing you're faced with is this must be extremely unusual. That's the first point. The second point is that the reason given in Deuteronomy for that invasion of Canaan is moral. It's because of the extreme wickedness, and it involved some of the worst excesses of child sacrifice that the world has ever seen. And in fact, the bigger biblical picture is, as it puts it, that God waited for 400 years. And waited and waited and waited, and he allowed that entry into the land of Canaan to coincide with the zenith of that wickedness and judged it. The next point is that God told Israel if they behaved the same way, they'd receive the same punishment. So this isn't a question of an arrogant nation coming in to ethnically cleanse. They're told you must deal with that because it's morally evil, but if you compromise with the same thing, you're going to get the same punishment. And that actually happened. So that what it then resolves itself to, and now I'm indebted to the scholars, like Nicholas Wolterstorff here, and is he in Harvard, I think, or Yale, who study this in detail. There's a big conference on this just recently. All this business to kill them all, and it's repeated. And he points out that it's repeated so often that it must be an ancient formulaic. Now, if I said to you, all England came to the funeral of Princess Diana, well, some people were in bed with flu, you know, and but we know what it means, a substantial quantity. And Waltersdorf's conclusion, as one of the world's leading biblical scholars, is that what this means is score a decisive victory over. And the reason it's in one of the most moral books of the Old Testament is that the rules of war contained in that book were not actually broken. Because if you ask yourself the question, were all these cities wiped out? The answer is no, because they all reappear again, populated. So it wasn't carried out in the literalistic sense. And so for all of those reasons, I think we're beginning to get a picture that changes. And also the idea that the God of the Old Testament is an angry God, the God of the New is a God of love. Not so. The God is a God of mercy, long-suffering. All of that is from the Old Testament, not from the New. So I think there are ways of approaching that, but they leave a huge question. And the huge question is, and this is what we don't like, we don't like the concept of judgment. We like it even less if human agency is involved, like Joshua to judge a tribe, but we don't like it. People were killed, but as I said before, there are many innocent people will die before the end of our session. So we've got to face then this, and it is really that final question, that question of judgment and justice. And you see, this is a very important part of my Christianity. Dawkins, in that quote, I didn't quote it all for sake of time, he says, the world has no justice. Now, here's the tragedy. I talked to him about this in one of our debates, and he said, we must work for justice in this world. And I said, yes, Richard, we must. But let's be realistic. How privileged we are here. We have some hope if something goes wrong that we'll get justice. But the multi-millions of people in the world will not get justice in this life. And if death is the end, they will never get justice. Now, I take that very seriously indeed. Here we are as human beings that cry for justice. And as Lewis points out, it would be a very strange world in which we got thirsty, but there was no such thing as water. In which we felt sexual desire and there was no such thing as sexual satisfaction. That would be a very strange world. And it would be a very strange world if we cry for justice, and justice is a huge concept in our society, and yet we adhere to a philosophy that denies it ultimately. There's no ultimate justice. So in the end, the terrorist who destroys you, your family, and maybe part of your nation, then shoots himself at the end, gets away with it. That seems to me to contradict every basic thing that constitutes us as humans. And what the Bible says is there will be a final judgment. And that's announced as a wonderful thing to be greeted. That God will judge the world, because the person he's going to judge the world through is the same person that suffered on the cross and rose again. And that's where I bring all this together. That I believe, let me put it very provocatively, I believe that if we could see what God has done with people who suffered innocently and so on, we would just be silent and have no more questions. Because if there is a God of love, as I believe there is, who's like Jesus Christ, I believe he will compensate in a way that will leave us all with nothing more to say. But we'll only see that when we've come to see the whole picture.
John, I was going to ask you to make some concluding remarks. I don't know how you can improve on that one.
I've made them. Thank you very much.
So we're going to transition now to questions that have been submitted by all of you. We've been working busily, not me, but people have been working busily behind there to questions. We're not going to get through nearly enough of them tonight, but John's going to review them on modern technology, the iPad, and try to answer some of these questions for us.
Okay, well, we'll start into this, and I've got a collection here, and it's lovely to have a collection because I could just flick through and see what ones come again and again. There are probably 700 pages of these, and let's see. Unfortunately, this iPad has doubled up in the printing. But let's have a go at what we've got so far. What is the explanation of the genocide of the Canaanites? Well, I think I've anticipated that question and dealt with it. Doesn't this lead to God being the direct author of their suffering? The answer is that God, the interesting part is the end bit. God will ultimately judge. He will be the direct author of the judgment of every man and woman that have ever lived or will live. And of course that raises the question, and it's a question we haven't dealt with. Is there a provision for facing that judgment? And I believe that this is part of the message of the cross. You see, what I've said so far is that the cross of Christ enables me to see a rationale in a God who suffers, but it's far bigger than that, because through that suffering and death, God has provided a basis on which he can accept people and forgive them. And therefore, and it's an amazing statement, let me quote it to you. You imagine Jesus on earth, he said this, "He that hears my word and believes on him that sent me shall not come into judgment." How do you know? Well, I'm the judge. It's a staggering claim. It's either true or it's nonsense. And so it all goes back to what's the evidence for its truth. And I think the major evidence is in the resurrection. I haven't time to go into the detail of that. I'll go to the next question. Should the fact, here's a very interesting one, that I am primarily drawn to religion only when in emotional pain, serve as a flag that my desire for knowing God is only a byproduct of pain? Well, there are many reasons for being drawn to God, and none of them is perfect. And reacting to pain is as good a reason as any. You see, let me step back from this, because hanging behind it is the great white elephant of the Freudian explanation of things, you see, that your religion, yes, of course you believe in God, because poor Irishman that you are, you need some sort of father figure in the sky, and when you get into trouble, he'll emotionally help you. And it's totally obvious why you believe in God. That's the God delusion. But of course that works both ways. As Czesław Miłosz pointed out, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in Poland, he said atheism is the great delusion. It's the wish fulfillment of not wanting to beat God. You see, let me quote to you the German psychiatrist Manfred Lutz. He's written a brilliant book called Eine kleine Geschichte des Größten. I say it in German because it's not in English yet. It's called A Brief History of the Great One. And he makes the point. He said, if there is no God, then Freud gives you a brilliant explanation of why religion is wish fulfillment, if there is no God. But of course, if there is a God, Freud gives you an equally brilliant explanation why atheism is the wish fulfillment. The thing that Freud can't do is to help you to decide whether there's a God or not. You must look elsewhere. And if I may tell you a slightly amusing incident recently, Stephen Hawking was asked about religion, and he said, religion, it's a fairy story for people afraid of the dark. And the London Times asked me to comment, and I said, do you want a one-liner? Oh, they said, yes, please. So I said, atheism is a fairy story for people afraid of the light. So, coming back to this question, it's okay to be drawn to God by an emotional need of pain and suffering, but it would be wise not to leave it there. In other words, it would be wise to find bigger reason. You see, I'm drawn to doctors by pain and suffering. Do you see what I mean? But that's not the whole of life, is it? And it's just important to realize that if there's a real emotional need, and that emotional need is satisfied by a relationship with God, that's not a proof that it's invalid. It's only invalid if God isn't real, but it's valid if God is real. Do you see what I'm saying? So that's important. But I wouldn't leave it there, because we need to grow up and realize that God is related not just to our needs. He's not like a doctor that we use from time to time. People don't like to be used, do they? You see, the word use of a person is interesting. Kant always said that people should never be regarded as means, but also as ends. Now, there are people we use. I've used quite a few taxi drivers since I've been here in the United States, but I've used their professional. I don't regard them as just object or people to be used, because they've got families and I'll talk to them and so on. And it's very important to realize that God is a person, not a theory. And what he's interested in is a personal relationship with us. And if we're only going to God when we're in trouble, we're treating him as someone to be used, which is okay, but it's not big enough. And until your relationship with God grows through that, you'll not have the confidence in God that you could have, because he'll only be working in a very small area of your experience. Now, is it possible suffering has been part of God's plan for humanity since the beginning? That is to suggest there is no indication for the Genesis account that creation did not include mortality, struggle, and suffering. Oh, but there is, ladies and gentlemen. If you look at the Genesis account, the interesting thing is you are given at the beginning a description of an idyllic paradise where people had no sense of distance from God, where they were in a beautiful garden, and where they were given fascinating tasks that legitimized Cornell University. Did you realize that, by the way, that your legitimation comes from the Bible? The famous command of God to the first humans to name the animals is the beginning of taxonomy. And taxonomy, naming things, is the essential part of every academic discipline here. You know names that I don't know in your discipline. I know names that you won't know. Taming things by naming them is an essential part. God told us to do it. He didn't do it for us. And that's one of the marvelous things about Genesis. This was exciting exploration. And then came the entry of sin through human choice. So when you say God's plan, suffering is part of God's plan, I'm a bit concerned of the word plan. Now, there is a backstory. It's more complex than that. The creation of the potential of saying no. There was no permission, but there was the capability. God gave us a magnificent gift, the capacity of rejecting him, because that's just the flip side of the capacity of trusting him. He gave us the dignity of being able to choose and therefore being able to develop a loving relationship, and that includes the other side. That brought with it, according to the Genesis story, on the physical side, a lot of damage, so that when we now look at our world, it's like Coventry Cathedral. You go into it, you see that a bomb has hit it, but you also see the traces of its original, unspoiled beauty. So I think that the creation at the beginning, there was no human suffering. Now that raises a lot of other questions that, if you want to pursue it, ladies and gentlemen, this is shameless advertising, and I know you're not allowed to do it at university, but the questioner who's interested in this, the rest of you don't listen, and then it won't be advertising. I've written a book called 7 Days That Divide the World on that early part of Genesis, because many people feel a great tension between it and science. And in the appendices, I go into a lot of these questions about the fall and what it meant and what it didn't mean. We can't begin to go into it tonight because there are a whole lot more questions. When Christians struggle with doubt, what's a wise way to go about dealing with it? Is pervasive doubt something we can repent from? As college students, how can we protect our minds and hearts when the academy often teaches Christianity as irrational or irrelevant? Well, that's a question written by Christian. And my response to it is that Don't ever try to suppress your doubts. That's the crucial thing. I've lived my life by asking questions and doubting. Doubting is just the flip side of faith. I was brought up to ask questions. In fact, I love playing Socrates. He's my intellectual hero. I ask more questions than I try to answer, because that's the way we learn. So the way in which my own faith, and this is a very personal question here, but let me answer it. I have deliberately gone out of my way for my whole life to expose my faith to criticism, contradiction, objection, vilification, mockery, every conceivable thing. Why? Because I want to know if it's true or not. So if you've got doubts, dubitare in Latin, to be in two minds. Of course, look, when you mention the word doubt, the moment we mention it, all of us, we tend to think of that paralyzing, sickening black hole that hits us when we've forgotten to prepare for an exam. You know, that kind of thing. That's the extreme case. Questioning is a very healthy thing. And if you suppress your questions, they can grow until they lead to that black hole. So avoid it by being honest with your questions. Now, you're in a university. You're going to hear all kinds of worldviews. That's healthy for you. That's a wonderful thing. And it's very important to learn to cope with that and listen, and even more than that, befriend people who do not share your worldview, because you'll learn an enormous amount from them, as I have done the whole of my life. We need to grow up in a pluralistic society to listen, but to formulate our own worldview by seeing how other worldviews cope with the big questions. That is what a university is all about. And of course you'll hear different things from your professors. So that's that. Let's go. Why is Christianity necessary for morality? I don't have to be religious to restrain myself from hurting somebody. Absolutely not. Now, this is important because I'm sure, I'll not read the whole question, it's quite long. I'm sure you've met good atheists and bad atheists, good Christians and bad Christians. Yes, of course. I would want to argue with Dostoyevsky. Dostoyevsky, I found very interesting. The Russians don't have so many philosophers as they have novelists who deal with the big questions of life in their novels. And The Brothers Karamazov is one of those novels, which deals with the problem of pain and evil and so on. And in the book, Dostoyevsky has the statement made, if there is no God, everything is permissible. Now, that is frequently misunderstood to mean that atheists can't behave morally. That's absurd nonsense. In fact, my atheist friends can put me to shame. Why? Because they're moral beings made in the image of God, just as much as I am. And I'm just perfectly capable of being a moral fool as anybody else. And so we need to learn, ladies and gentlemen, I've had to learn this by experience, to really respect the fact that the image of God resides in every human being. So when I meet them, I respect them. They're infinitely valuable in the eyes of God. I don't find that in other philosophies, by the way, which is one of the reasons I'm a Christian. So that's enormously important. So my answer to your question is, of course, atheists can behave morally. There's no question about that. But at the level of logic and philosophy down below it, I do not believe that you can warrant morality on the basis of atheism. As Richard Dawkins and Nietzsche pointed out, and many other people have pointed out, if you abolish God and abolish absolutes, then in a way, your opinion is as good as mine. And everything becomes relative. Of course it does, and we can see its effect now in Western society. You don't have to be a genius to see that. If you teach people constantly that there are no absolutes and there's no transcendence, then each person will become their own autonomous moral center. And we get into a fearful mess. So it's at the level of the warrant, just as I believe that atheists can do equally good science to Christians. The Nobel Prize was won recently in physics by an atheist, Peter Higgs. It was won a few years back by Bill Phillips, an American Christian. They're physics equally brilliant. One's a Christian, one's an atheist. So they can both do equally good physics. But what I would want to argue is there's no rationale in atheism to allow me to trust the cognitive faculties of my mind. There isn't Christianity. So that's the level at which I would approach that. Let's see, have we a bit more time?
We've got time for maybe 2 more questions.
Okay, let's have a look. Oh, wow. Oh, I've been asked the question about predestination and free will. How many hours have you got, ladies and gentlemen? Part of your argument, let me be fair to the questioner, part of your argument, these are very interesting questions, is supported by the idea that in order to have love, you must have a choice, which to me implies free will. Is this your point of view? If not, how do you make the idea of predestination compatible with the requirement of choice for the existence of love? That's a very perceptive question. And I'll give you the short answer to it, because it could lead us into a vast discussion. The key is to ask predestination to what? You see, in Christian theology, we often use words like predestination, election, and so on. We never finish the sentence. For instance, and that's why I think there's no contradiction here, I do firmly believe that we are given real choice. I believe it on the basis of the biblical description, but even more so, according to the New Testament, the final judgment is going to operate on the question of whether I have believed or not. If I'm not capable of believing, that's utterly immoral. That's pretty strong, but that's how I take it. If I'm going to be judged for not believing, then I must have that capacity to believe. Whatever we think about predestination. But then when you read the New Testament and take it seriously and finish the sentence. See, let me give you a little analogy. One of the not an analogy, a direct quote from the New Testament. Those that God called, he predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. That's what God chose to do with those who trust him. Or, in another place, he predestined us to be before him in glory. But people misread it. And the moment they see the word predestined, they think that is God determining your fate. Of course it isn't. Suppose I have no children, and I want to adopt 2 children, and I go to an orphanage and I choose a child to be in my family. That's one thing. It's a very different thing if it's a sunny day and I have children in my family, whether adopted or not, and I choose to take them either to the mountains or to the sea. You've always got to ask, when you see this word predestined, chose, what for? And you'll find that none of the occurrences in the New Testament in any way communicates the idea that God has chosen one to be saved, to put it very bluntly, and another to be lost, apart from their choice. That would be totally immoral. So that's the way I handle that. Now, you said one more, did you?
One more, John, yeah.
Okay, one more. Okay. Just give me a second here. Just want to be fair to the questioners. Okay. So unfortunately, there's one I just can't read at all. Yes, I'll go back to part of a question I didn't read, which I think is quite important. The one about the good atheists and bad atheists. Religion has little to do with the quality of a person, from my experience. So let me end with that, because it raises, I'm sad that that's your experience, actually. Because if religion means anything at all, I don't like the word religion, actually. And that enables me to explain this. You see, the person asking this question has a negative experience of what they call religion. It's nothing to do with the quality of life. There's something seriously wrong there. And I'd like to unpack that just as we finish, because that opens the window into asking the question, what is religion really? The Bible uses the word very rarely. It says true religion is to visit widows and orphans in their affliction and keep yourself unspotted from the world. It's an interesting definition, isn't it? In other words, true religion, piety, is shown in our action, in the quality of our life. So that contradicts this. There's something very wrong with the religious experience of the person that asked the question. Now, I'm not blaming them. Absolutely not. Because if you step back from this whole question of religion, and I think I saw there the beginnings of a question, but it's got double typed on, what is the difference between religions? Well, here is the important thing, and it's a very important thing. When you come to discuss the matter of religion, in a pluralistic society in this room, we have representatives of different religions. We can only talk about it at all if we respect each other as human beings. Now, to help you do that, the important thing to realize is if you take every religion in the world, every philosophy in the world, you'll find a very big common moral element. The golden rule occurs everywhere, Roman pagan religion, Buddhism, Confucianism, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, British humanism, the whole works. Fascinating. That's the only reason society can survive, because we have hardwired, as some people put into it, an essentially common morality. There are nuances and variations, I know. So that when I meet my friends in other religions, I want to make utterly sure that they know that I respect them as moral beings, equally made in the image of God as myself. Now, having said that, the fact is there are differences. Now, there are sad differences like the one you represent, where religion has no connection with moral quality. Let's leave that aside, because that immediately discredits the person, whatever claim they make, even if it's a Christian claim, perhaps especially if it's a Christian claim. If there's no evidence in my life that God has transformed me, well then forget about anything I say. It's got to be real, ladies and gentlemen. It's got to be real. But I think that when I ask, and I do this frequently when I talk to people of different religions, there are two ways of approaching it. One is this. If you take Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, my Jewish friends believe that Jesus died and didn't rise. My Muslim friends believe he didn't die. I believe he both died and rose. It's logically obvious all three of those cannot be true. So there's a historic, and by the way, I've never had any difficulty with my Muslim and Jewish friends, whom I honor, in discussing these things, because they will say exactly the same. They recognize those differences, and also recognize, many, that those differences have to be settled. You have to decide on the basis of evidence. And I would encourage you, wherever you stand, check out the evidence, because faith, if it's going to mean anything, has got to be evidence-based. But now there's another way of approaching things. Many of my friends tell me religion is like Cornell University. It's got an entrance gate. I don't mean a physical one, I mean an exam or some sort of thing that you get in. Ceremony, you get in. And then there's a way, the Cornell way. And you better keep on it if you're going to get a degree. And you've all sorts of nice professors, like Professor Avery, to help you. But however nice she is, she can't guarantee you're going to get a degree at the end, can you?
Well, they can always ask me.
Yeah, but you can't guarantee it.
No, it's true.
Because there's a whacking great gate at the end, and it's called final exams. You've heard of it?
Yeah.
Now, the whole basic principle of Cornell University is merit, and rightly so. Many people think that that's religion. That you've got an entrance ceremony, some sort of initiation, right? You've got a way, you've got gurus or something to teach you. But in the end, there's some sort of final assessment, and the whole thing depends on your merit. Now, I would not want anybody to go away with the impression tonight that that's what Christianity is, because it isn't. Ladies and gentlemen, this is dramatic to my mind. That is what many people think Christianity is, along with every other religion. But Christianity starts not with a ceremony, but with a person that says, I am the door. And Jesus stands claiming to be God and says the entry onto the way, and he says he is the way, is by trusting him. And now here comes the crunch. I said it before, I'll say it again. He that believes my word shall not come into judgment. What? That means that we can know the verdict at the beginning. That's dramatically different from all other philosophies or religions. Let me put it this way, ladies and gentlemen. Jesus Christ competes with no one because he offers something that no one else offers. That is forgiveness, known now, so that you're not on the way hoping to get in at the end. You've already been received. May I illustrate that? Because some people find this very difficult to grasp. My first day in Cambridge, I saw a magnificent vision. She was 16 years old. And she was beautiful. So I decided I would marry her. So I came to her and I presented her with a book of rules. It's called a cookbook. And I said to her, you know, Sally, I'd like to marry you, but of course I couldn't accept you now. It's going to be like this. Here are the rules for making an apple cake. I really like apple cake. Thou shalt take 1 kilo of flour, 3 kilos of sugar, 4 tanks of water, and thou shalt mix them all together, and so on, and that. Now, if you keep these rules for, let's say, 40 years, then I'll think of accepting you. How would you think of that as a marriage proposition? Yet there are multi-millions of people think of God exactly like that. Isn't that staggering? I would have insulted that girl if I'd said that. What is the secret of my marriage? I've been married 45 years. What's the secret of it? That right at the very beginning, I accepted her unconditionally and she me. So now, to keep the cooking analogy, she cooks not to gain my acceptance, but because she's got it. And that's all the difference in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, I said this the other night to a crowd like you. I don't go around the world talking about God and science and these topics to gain God's acceptance. I do it because I've already got it. And that is, in my experience of the world, utterly unique. The question is it true? And that's something that you have to decide. Thank you very much. I want you to thank a very special moderator who's done a brilliant job.
Tonight, I hope my mic is on. Is my mic on? Good. Just before we end tonight, during dinner, you actually told us quite an interesting story, and I want, because I love my students so much, I really want them to be challenged by. You talked a little bit about intellectual growth and spiritual growth during the path of being in college. Can you challenge them in that way to end this evening?
Well, I certainly can. One of the things I noticed at Cambridge was that we grow intellectually at 2 speeds. Now, this is something for Christians, but if you're not, don't want to hear it, close your ears, but it's relevant to everybody actually, whatever worldview you have. Our academic career goes up steeply, especially if you're privileged to be at a place like this, because it means you're really bright, let's face it. So you go up like this. But very often, in terms of your grasp of your worldview, it remains on the child's level. And many Christians, and this is a tragedy, have allowed their grasp of the Bible and the way it interacts with the big questions of life to remain at the Sunday school level. So that at the point when they're up here intellectually, some of their peers ask them questions about their faith in God, and they don't know what to say. And their peers immediately see that they're like children, and that's the end of it. What that does is to force that person's faith in God into the private sphere. I meet many people, well, I'm old now, but let's say in their 50s, 40s, they're brilliant. They go to church, they read their Bible, they say their prayers, but there's never any cutting-edge engagement with the secular world because they've nothing to say. And my challenge to young people is, if you're gifted with the ability of Cornell students, whatever worldview you hold, it applies to everybody, pay attention to it. And you've got loads of time. Well, you may not have, but ask yourself how much time you spend, yes, even Cornell students, playing video games, Facebook, the internet. And then ask yourself, do I really have time to develop? Because if you want to be credible, you've got to put the same kind of effort into what you believe about the big questions as you do into these other fields. And I was glad I was taught that when I was 18 or 19. Of course, you can't always do that. You've got to spend the vast proportion of your time when you're studying mathematics at mathematics. But if you've got it into your head that it's equally important to develop this, it will make a tremendous difference to the contribution that you can make to society around. And that, I would say, applies whether you're a Christian or not. But I say it from my heart as a Christian who would love to see young people developing an intellectual cutting edge by growing up to realize that the Bible actually deals with the big questions in a credible, intellectually understandable way. My little message.
Mission accomplished, challenge given, all of you. Okay. Well done. Thank you, John.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.